everyone, and welcome to this HVG event this afternoon. We're going to be following on from a session that we ran a couple of months ago all around inclusive recruitment. And this time we're going to be looking at recruitment process and some of the vetting procedures that we might be using, and what, if anything, we can do to safeguard our organisations, but also make sure that we aren't putting up extra barriers to volunteering. So I'm really delighted to welcome and thank Helen Harris, who's going to lead the first part of this session. So Helen is on the committee for HVG Yorkshire, but also in her own right is volunteer manager at York. So Helen, I'm going to hand over to you to do proper introductions. Thank you so much for leading this bit.
Lovely. Thanks, Rhiannon. Hi there, everybody. So yeah, as Rhiannon said, I'm Helen. I'm the head of volunteering at York Archaeology. And for those of you who don't know who we are, we're basically a self-funded educational charity that also is a professional organisation undertaking a range of archaeological services to both commercial clients and within communities. And what we then do is share the findings and the research and the objects we've discovered back out into the community through our public engagement work, but also through our 5 attractions in York. So we've got offices in Nottingham, Sheffield and York, but we've also got 5 visitor attractions in York. The most famous of those known to people is probably the Jorvik Viking Centre. So what I'm just going to do is just bear me one moment whilst I share a presentation with you. And just make sure, brilliant, thanks Rhiannon, that you can all see that. I've got a thumbs up, which is very helpful. So the purpose of today's session was really to share with you the findings of a benchmarking survey on volunteer recruitment that some of you might have very kindly taken part in when Matt sent it out on my behalf at the back end of last year. What prompted us as an organisation to want to do that was that we were very much reviewing our own recruitment processes alongside redoing our safeguarding policy and procedures. And what we were interested in looking at was a thing that I think probably many of us have been considering recently, which is how can we modernise what for us were quite static recruitment processes. They've been like that for many, many years, to make them more accessible, to reach new audiences, while still maintaining good, safe standards of recruitment. And what we wanted to see was, particularly because we hadn't updated our procedures in a long time, what other people were doing, whether we were wildly different than you all, and how accessible our procedures might look against other people as well. So we sent the survey out via a Google form, which had 12 questions, and they were very much focused on the procedures that we undertake, the actual steps that might happen from the point of application through to the point of somebody starting a role. And I'm just going to see if this is going to let me change my screens, which it's not looking like it is. Well, bear me one moment. I'm not used to being on Zoom. I'm usually doing things via Google, so it's slightly different for me. Right, I'm just going to restart that and see if that works again. Right, there we go. Hopefully you can all see a new screen. So it was sent out to around about 600 to 700 people, and we got about 30 responses. So one thing is just to say that we are looking at a relatively small sample of us, but from lots of different organisations and different types of organisations. So hopefully, from what I could see from the answers, because it was anonymous, it nonetheless gives us a good sweep of the different things that different places are doing. One of the first questions that we asked was around the actual application process itself. So we asked whether or not we required potential volunteers to complete a written application form. And just for clarity, that could be online or in paper. It didn't matter which way it was. It was just trying to see, was there a formal way in which we undertook those applications? And when we were looking at that, then basically the majority of us were, as hopefully you can see on that screen, nearly 87% of people were asking for some form of formal application process to take place. There was only just over 13% of us who weren't having any sort of form that took place for people to actually express an interest in joining. What we then wanted to work out was how adaptable that process was currently as a sector for people. So were those forms causing barriers? And if they were, did we have any ways in which we could try to circumnavigate those for people? So our second question was, did you accept applications in any other formats for accessibility reasons? And in terms of answers for that, then the majority of us, yes, we were. 75% of people would allow paper forms. That was if their majority of their applications took place online. So with us, for example, the first port of call somebody gets to is an online link to fill the form in, which obviously if somebody's got any digital access issues, then that isn't going to be suitable for them. We also found that just over 42% of people were allowed to record the information on behalf of volunteers. That's probably our current next step as well, is if somebody had a problem with filling in the form, even doing it in paper, if that was just prohibitive or daunting for them, then we will usually meet them for a cup of tea and fill that out for them. And it seemed that that was something that a lot of people were doing. Nearly 11% of people had got a really interesting way of allowing video submissions. So I think one person said, basically short little videos that people could just record themselves with talking about why they wanted to volunteer, which was a really nice idea, I thought. Other people did say that they do tend to rely more on informal ways of having applications. So, for example, things like emails, or relying more on things like recruitment sessions where you talk to people and just got an idea on what they would want to do. And they were around about 4% of people who were responding. We did have one person who did do more formal CV and covering letters, but generally what the observations seemed to be is that people were really happy, even if they didn't already expressly say that they would offer alternate means, to let people apply in alternate ways. One observation that did seem to keep coming up quite consistently was that a number of us had noted that although we were prepared to do that, we perhaps weren't expressly saying that very much within the actual advertisement process, and there was room for us to actually kind of flag that for people a little bit more. We then moved on to a really broad question, which was, do you undertake any of the following? And that following, if you took part in the survey, asked a number of different things. For example, did you undertake ID? Did you undertake references? Did you undertake DBS checks? And that was then broken down into, is it for all roles or specific roles? Was it one reference or two references? So the next slide is just focus on some of the findings of that. In terms of an application process, when I'm talking about interviews here, we mean anything from an informal chat, group meetings, virtual calls, telephone calls. Really just, was there some way in which you were matching a volunteer with a role, so that in essence the application form was an application form that you were then selecting from, or was it more just registering to interest and you took anybody who was wanting to volunteer? So it seems that most of us were doing some form of matching. Generally speaking, that was quite an informal process, with about 85% of people doing that as an in-person meeting. Generally speaking, we assumed that to be one-on-one, because we've then got about 42% of people saying that they would do group meetings or group role matching sessions, which is actually what we moved to a while ago. We will still offer one-on-one meetings, but we do tend to do more group sort of activity-based sessions. And then there were people also offering virtual options and telephone meetings as well. So quite a sweep of different ways that we do match people, but some form of process for that. In terms of asking people whether they took references or not, then again, this would depend on, we were asking people, did they take one or two references for all roles or specified roles? This got quite a big split of responses with it. But broadly, most people, over 40% of people, were undertaking some form of reference. So whether that was one reference or two references, that all varied, as you can see on the screen. One reference for all roles was about 20% of people. Two references for all roles was about 26%. But if we combine those together, that's just under 50% of people doing some form of referencing. and around about a quarter of us, just under, weren't undertaking references at all. In terms of the types of references or how we take them, then most people were taking those in writing, but in an informal way, letters or emails. There was a small percentage of about just under 30% who were taking that by set referencing forms, and just under 40% would take it over the phone as well. In terms of who they would accept them for in terms of length of time and, you know, how they would have known that person, then I'm just going to pull that up on my phone so I can't see all my notes on this screen. In essence, the majority of people, as I say, were taking references, but would take them from personal referees. So that's things like neighbours, family, friends, somebody who wasn't related to you. So about 58% of people, 45% of people, that was from recognised organisations. So that's things like faith groups, doctors, somebody that's known the volunteer in some sort of professional capacity. Only about 12% of people are asking for professional references, so that's things like teachers or ex-employers, and around about 37% of people didn't require any references at all for any roles, and the same number of people would accept internal references. So that is where you would perhaps have a volunteer moving into a different role, you as perhaps their volunteer coordinator, if they were moving into, say, a paid role, would be able to act as a reference for them. Most people were looking at that they could have any length of time with the people that responded, that people had known them before. There was a small percentage of people, about 8.3% for each type, that needed them to have known them for 6 months, 1 year or 2 years, but it was a similar amount when you combine it. But as I say, it was the area that we'd got most variability in, just in terms of how many references, where we take them from, that sort of thing. In terms of ID, then we had got a fairly big lead in people not taking ID for any role, 64.3%. And of those people who were ID checking, be that either for specified roles or for all roles, did seem to be linked to DBS checks, both in terms of what people were responding to, 58.3% of people saying that was why they were doing them, safer recruitment with 41.7%, or security checks for 33%. And the types of ID that they were taking generally match that as well. So photo ID, the sorts of things that you're asked to do when you do a DBS check. And in terms of DBS checks, then probably this one is, as a lot of us would expect, about 43% of people were doing those for specified roles, but the majority of us weren't doing them for all roles, or in the same thing, weren't doing them for any roles. We're basically, depending on the role that the volunteer is doing, is when we're needing to do those checks. And of those people that were doing them for all roles, it did seem to match up with those organisations who'd got collections or national funding, or a reason why there were security elements that they had to do that for all volunteers and staff. So as a sort of summary of what we found out, it would seem that most of us were facing the same challenges, and I'll come on to that in a minute in terms of some of the comments that people left in the open boxes. They were very similar sorts of questions as we were raising, really, of how did we get that balance that we were looking for in terms of accessibility, and widening the audiences we could reach by making it more accessible, but making sure that the recruitment practices were safe. The specific steps that we take are varied, particularly around exactly what we do when it comes to references, but most of us did appear to be taking references, and DBS checks where needed were something that we were also doing. And there was a real willingness to adapt application forms and processes with that. Just a kind of comment generally with us that potentially we needed to advertise that better within our own organisation, so people were aware of it at the point of application. Certainly in terms of our own experience, this would seem to match up with what we were finding. References is currently one of the areas that we're still grappling with how to get the right balance on it. We, as I say, undertook this process of review ourselves alongside our safeguarding policy and procedure updates. And where we've got to, just to give you an idea on our journey so far, is that we continue to make use of online applications. We basically use Better Impact. That's for a number of different reasons, including the volume of people that we're sometimes welcoming at any one time. But I think we are really aware of the fact that that isn't something that will be accessible to everybody. And we want to look at ways of making it clearer at the point of advertisement that you don't have to use that process to apply with us if you don't want to. We have changed recently from asking for 2 references for every volunteer role to 1 reference, but the criteria for those references has also changed so that they now need to be, same as it would be on a passport application, a person of good standing, which narrows the field as to who we can allow to act as a referee for quite considerably as to where we were before. So it does now need to be somebody like someone who's known them in a previous volunteer capacity, a faith group leader, a doctor. So if somebody hasn't had contact regularly or for some time with any of those sorts of people or groups, then we haven't necessarily got a way of getting a suitable reference for them at the moment. We also do DBS checks where needed. Basically, that's for any regulated roles. A lot of our roles aren't regulated because they aren't in a position whereby they are regularly working with children or vulnerable adults on their own. But we have got some roles that we might be bringing in that need that. We also require all our volunteers to have signed to say they've read our safeguarding policies and procedures and they undertake basic safeguarding training, which again is under review at the moment, but will still be an element of the induction process. And we've removed the need for ID checks on guidance from NCVO and many different discussions with our solicitors to basically just make sure that as an organisation, we were comfortable with the fact that our volunteer involving procedures are rigorous enough that we don't ever put people into a position, as we shouldn't do, where they are seen as or treated as employees, and therefore the right to work check isn't needed. Although there have been questions sometimes around whether or not does that still tick all the security checks that we might need to do. There's a lot we still want to do. I think a lot of it comes around signposting very early on. Some of the things that I think came up in Tamsin's presentation a while ago about how we can tell people about the different ways they can apply, how we can put the material in lots of different formats. We use things like visual stories for our visitors, so pictorial walkthroughs of what to expect when you visit, and we'd like to do that a little bit more for volunteers as well. And as I say, our big question at the moment is how we overcome the references element. At the moment, it isn't a problem because we don't have a particularly diverse audience that we're reaching in terms of many of our volunteers are students, so they have readily available lecturers and people from the university that can act as referees, but we want to widen our pool. And as we start to do that, we already know from some of the groups we've worked with, things like references become a real barrier for people. So I don't think, unfortunately, it's provided as perhaps as expected with any sort of definite answers that we can say, here's a shining light of the best practice way through. But I think it did bring some comfort to know that we are facing very similar challenges. And I think when we start talking about it and putting our heads together, there's probably an awful lot of skills we've each got and information that we can share to help push this debate forward and see what some of the outcomes might be in the future. I'll hand back to you, Rhiannon.
Great, thank you, Helen. Do you want to stop sharing for a moment? Yeah, lovely. Just wanted to see if there's any immediate questions that came out of the presentation before we're going to break into a breakout room. I had a question, and then there's a couple in the chat as well. Alongside the sort of the intel that you ask for around kind of recruitment practice, did you ask for any information around the scale and nature of the organisation to put their kind of recruitment practice into context?
We didn't, and I think that's actually something that would have been really useful to add in. Like all surveys, once you've done it, there's something you go back on, isn't there? And you think, oh, we should have asked that. We wanted to try to keep it as anonymous as possible so that people felt really comfortable sharing very honestly where they were with their organisation at the moment and their concerns. But also to keep it really short because we're aware of the fact that everybody's very busy and nobody really likes filling out a survey. So we were trying to keep it to about 10 questions. We didn't quite manage that, but we got near.
Brilliant. Thank you. Alex, and then there's one in the chat we'll go to as well.
Oh, it's just a quick question about the references. I found that by putting like a person of good standing, similar to like the passport, would be a barrier for a lot of people. Certainly people that would volunteer at my library museum in Bolton. It's like references already are quite difficult, for many people to actually create. But putting that barrier of person of good standing, I think, would actually make it decrease access for a number of people.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's quite a new thing that's come in for us, and it's off the back of a review of our safeguarding and advice that is something that we should be doing. But the recruitment benchmarking survey is one thing that I've asked to bring back to our senior leadership team so we can discuss that further, because I know absolutely that some of the people who would like to join us are not going to be able to have somebody offer a reference that meets that criterion. We don't have a plan B at the moment for them, which is what I'd like to get to, is that we at very least say, if that's something that we feel we must do, then we at least have an option whereby if somebody can give us a reason why they can't provide that, we can look at alternatives that everybody's comfortable with. Because yes, I anticipate it being a problem for us.
Thank you.
Yeah. We'll just take a couple more comments, because then what we want to do is to go into breakout rooms where we're going to explore this a little bit more in our in smaller groups according to the practice that we've got. So we'll go to Irene first, and then I suspect that Tamsin's going to come in with a lovely comment to help us realise the context. So Irene first.
Hi. Yeah, I just wondered what you did around collecting addresses and whether or not that was something. Sorry, I just realised my mic's up by my ear, so that's not helpful, is it? We're really struggling with what we need for acceptable purposes and what we need for safety purposes, and whether or not we don't currently take addresses for our volunteers. We're going to be recruiting around 2,000, and it's a huge undertaking, and I'm particularly having sleepless nights around nefarious activity in our volunteer uniform when we've got these massive events throughout the whole year. And I'm trying to mitigate some of that risk, but we don't legally need to know the address of the person. And I wondered how you kind of addressed that and what you did around sort of that situation.
We do currently take addresses, largely because I think it's just something that's not changed from many years ago when we had more people not on email. So it's just still there on the form and it's never been questioned. So we still do it. Very useful at Christmas, where up until quite recently, we used to send everybody a physical paper Christmas card. So it was used for a very sort of minor reason, but nobody's ever said that they weren't happy providing address. But I think it's a very good point that if we got somebody who hadn't got a fixed abode, again, it's a part of our standard application process that's making an assumption that somebody would be able to put that down. At the moment, it's all very informal, and we're trying to sort of always say to people, and we do that verbally a lot from the point of application, if there's any of this that causes you a problem, please do talk to us, and we would amend it as we went along. But that obviously doesn't help someone who might see that and not apply because they assume it's going to be a problem before they have the chance to have that conversation with us.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I would say where I work at ZSL is exactly the same. It's sort of a bit of a hangover from the days of yore. The only time that we do sometimes use it is when we're doing a little bit of a scrutiny on travel expenses. So we can cross-reference between what they said originally and what they're charging. But yes, I think as a rule of thumb, it's only asking the information that you actually need, isn't it? And it's always asking that question, do you need that information? Tamsin, and then we're going to break out.
Yeah, it was just a reflection around the concept of references and being really clear about why you're taking them, and is it around a risk assessment, and is it about safeguarding, or is it about you want to get a sense of their volunteer ethic and their experience elsewhere? Now, what we know from normal recruitment and selection in terms of recruiting for employees is that references are not worth the paper they are written on. Okay, so in terms of if you're getting references to say to Rhiannon, oh, a volunteer was working with you and now they'll want to come and work with me, the extent to which anything Rhiannon says is moderated by her view, bias and prejudice of that person, also of that historic context around that particular volunteering role, and also what that person was going through. So there might have been amazing with Rhiannon and then be not amazing with me, and conversely. So I think, you know, if we're thinking around capacity and the amount of time and process it takes, for me, the reference issue is really important when we're talking about safeguarding and risk, but less so around volunteer performance. And that's just wanted to reiterate that from a research perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, that's very much my reflection as well. I've only ever had one really useful reference where a reference was given and then 2 weeks later they retracted the reference because something had happened. Didn't disclose it, but it was obviously something that was problematic enough that they withdrew it. We're going to